common topics I bring up or concepts is not sacrificing truth for simplicity, which I think is super valuable. The idea being you you don't want to oversimplify things. You don't want to focus on just making it the easiest message, but by doing so, you actually dilute or sacrifice or eliminate the truth. And I try and live by that. What I've realized recently, though, is that I may have been neglecting the inverse of that. And I'll say it a different way, but conceptually, I think it's kind of the inverse. Um, the way I would say it is don't sacrifice being better for thinking better, right? So what do I mean by that? Don't lose sight of what is quote unquote right or good or important because you are so focused on just the actual truth and the facts. And, an example that highlights this that comes to mind for me, it's just based on a show that I just watched, so it's kind of top of mind, is I was watching a show, and it was one of the first shows I've watched that's come back since COVID and all the race issues in the country. And they were addressing some of that. And with some of the race issues, for example, George Floyd's situation is a perfect one. It can be easy for some people, myself included at times. It can be easy to sacrifice being better for thinking better. It can be easy to say, hey, let's look at all the facts, right? Maybe he was on drugs, or maybe he resisted somewhat, or maybe, right? You could start piecing together the story with facts, with things that are true. But what happens is you start sacrificing being better, what's right, what's important for the truth. And I think that's equally as dangerous as sacrificing the truth for simplicity. Now, the truth is always important, right? The truth is if you can find objective truth, or at least you can get close to it, that is what you should strive for. But part of the truth, if you will, is understanding the big picture, understanding the context, reading between the lines, seeing the nuance, seeing the complexity, right? If you're so focused on just saying, well, I want all the facts and I want the story, and you need to make sure you mention this, and you can't forget that this happened or that happened, that all may be true. But if you look at that in such a way where it doesn't allow you to see perhaps the bigger issue, and in the case of race issues and George Floyd, right, you can feel however you want to feel about that situation. But when somebody dies, seemingly unnecessarily, when there's a history or a pattern of racial issues in the country, we can get so caught up in trying to pinpoint what exactly is the issue. Is it systemic racism? Is it institutionalized racism? Is it a problem with all police? Is it more of a one-off type thing? Is it do white people get murdered by police or killed by police more than black people, right? We're looking for all these truths. We're looking for all these facts because we need all that. And don't get me wrong, that's important. The idea isn't to say throw away the truth. That's not at all the idea. But much like the concept of don't sacrifice the truth for simplicity, you have to strike that right balance. Do not sacrifice being better for trying to think better and to try and get to the truth and make sure you understand the issue, from all angles. You have to remember what you're actually trying to do. And in a case like that, where you're trying to make the world better, where you're trying to right injustices that are happening, when you're trying to fix deep social issues like that, you need to find that same balance. If you find yourself going too far in that other direction, right, wherever you hear, and when I say you, when I say we, I should really just be speaking for myself, because this is something that I do all too often, right? I believe, as much as I can believe anything, that I despise racism, that I wish it never existed, that it's one of the things most important to me in terms of teaching my son. I think about it often. How do I teach that in such a way in which he will understand what racism is and understand how dangerous and horrible it is, but also not allow it to, infiltrate his brain in some way, even if in some subtle way, right? So I believe that. But I also know that at times I sacrifice that concept and being better and trying to fix that with thinking better and trying to say, well, let's make sure we have the whole story and let's look at every fact and every detail and let's make sure the data is all there and we understand it before I commit to saying, well, this was a bad thing or this was a good thing. And obviously, if you've watched any of these videos, I think there's value in that. I think it's important to question. I think it's important to understand all perspectives and sides. But if you do it to a fault, if you do it out of balance, if you do it to a point where you lose sight of what the objective actually is, if you lose sight of actually being better, well, then what's it all for, really, right? And I've talked in past videos about my greatest fear about thinking better. And this whole concept that I talk about in these videos is that if, I lived in a time of slavery, for example, would I have seen it? Would I have known in that moment how horrific of an institution that is? Or, the more cliched things you hear, well, it was a different time then. And for some people, it wasn't, it wasn't as obvious that it was a horrible thing. I think that gets at the heart of what I'm trying to say. And I think as much as I remind myself on a daily basis or sometimes an hourly basis, hey, don't sacrifice the truth for simplicity, I need to be equally, maybe even more so, reminding myself, don't sacrifice being better for thinking better. Because for me, that's the risk point. For others, perhaps it goes the other way. But for me, I need to remember my risk point. And I have to remember, again, what the objective is and what we're actually trying to do.